So let's kind of, I'm gonna see what I can make of that. What sense I can make of that Walzer article for you. It's never okay for a government to sanction torture, apart from the question whether there ought to be warrants for it, and let's make it public. You know, I think this is what you can get out of this article, at least one of the things. On a straight-up consequentialist account of right action, there really can't be a dilemma. There can be difficulties knowing what the right thing to do is, right? Like, should we put fluoride in the drinking water? And maybe the facts of the matter are kind of difficult to get our hands on. We're not sure whether, you know, it has harmful effects on aquatic life and this kind of stuff. But these are empirical questions, and it can be really hard to know what the right thing to do is, even if we agree that the right thing to do is to bring about the best consequences, because we don't always know. Think of GMO you know, measure that we just voted on. It can be difficult. But in any case, the structure of morality for the consequentialist is pretty clear. The right is that which brings about or promotes the greatest amount of happiness, the good in general, but happiness if we're utilitarian. The deontologist or non-consequentialist says, you know, no, the right constrains the pursuit of the good. There are some things that mustn't be done in service of aggregating good consequences because they're just flat out impermissible or wrong. And there too, I mean, there might be some squeamishness about sticking to our guns and doing the right thing, even if the consequences seem like they might be better if we were to commit a you know, wrong action. But it would still be the case that one's hands were clean. So in a way, both the consequentialist and the non-consequentialist don't really think there can be a dilemma. If you're a straight-up utilitarian on this subject, then, well, again, you might be quite uncertain what the right thing to do is because you don't know what the heck's going to happen, a reasonable enough point. You can't really face a moral dilemma. If torture is the right thing to do ever, then it's the right thing, and the politician who sanctions it shouldn't feel any regrets. Might feel sad that the world works this way, you know, but that's kind of like the hunter who feels sad that the deer dies, but he knows he needs to feed his family or something like that. It's the way the world is. For the deontologist, I take it, again, if you've done the right thing and you're a good person, then the fact that good consequences weren't aggregated isn't your fault because you've done the right thing. It's kind of the Kantian idea. What Walzer presents us with is a different approach altogether, which is to say, you know, actually, maybe things don't square up quite so easily. Maybe, in point of fact, it could be the case that an action is both simultaneously the right thing to do and or at least a wrong thing to do. On this view, the world is ultimately kind of a tragic place, or a place that doesn't have, is not morally harmonious. There can be tragedies, there can be conflicts of obligations, and those conflicts don't get resolved. There isn't a deus ex machina out of or you know, God from the machine to sort of square it all up for us. What's that look like? Well, Weber, just to say a little bit more about it here, distinguishes between what he calls the ethics of conscience and the ethics of responsibility. This is in the article called Politics as Vocation that Walzer draws from. And the idea here is that the ethics of conscience is kind of deontological. It's kind of what a moralistic philosophy professor can have, since, let's face it, what he does doesn't have a whole lot of consequences in the world. I can say, you know, torture's wrong, but you know, ultimately my actions make very little difference in like what ends up happening in the world. And it's easy for me to sit there with my hands, you know, in prayerful repose, since ultimately I don't have a lot on since what I believe conscientiously doesn't have a whole lot of effects with respect to national policy on torturing people. Politicians, or specifically those in high places of high power, however, don't have that privilege, because the consequences are really high when they, or you know, the things that are at stake are pretty serious when they take the reins of power, particularly if they're in charge of a large country. And so if you think about President Bush after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, he's faced with difficult choices there. It's not easy to be in his spot. You can despise him as much as I do, and that would take some doing, incidentally. But it's not an easy spot to be in. All right, what do you do after 9/11? you know, there's a lot, you know, you're gonna have to throw some red meat to your constituents if you want to actually stay in power. But how do you do that in a responsible way? I can't say enough words in condemnation of his actions after 9/11. Words fail me. But at least let's acknowledge that after 9/11, President Bush had a really tough job on his hands. What was the right thing to do there? What was the right way to respond? And, you know, it's constructive, appropriate. That's not easy to say. So it's easy to have clean hands in that sense, right? To just have good intentions and not really take, precisely because one isn't in a position to have any consequences of serious note, a serious moment come from one's actions or inactions, right? I can just go home. I don't even have to have an opinion on this. I can just go home and cruise the web, check out the Blazers score. So, you know, it's not so easy. So obviously people who take power are a specific sort. That's an interesting question that Weber's kicking around in that. What kind of person would do that? What kind of person would want to become president of a powerful country? So anyway, the position that Walzer's suggesting is, in a way, that the politician doesn't have the easy kind of choice between these that many of us think we can have. And we can either be straight up utilitarians and say, as horrible as torture might be, or is, there might be occasions on which the predictable consequences of torturing this guy would be better than the predictable consequences of not torturing him. That cannot be ruled out by the consequentialists. Nor is it totally crazy. This doesn't have to be the jihadist guy. This could be a homegrown nut job like Timothy McVeigh. I understand that. You guys are too young to remember Timothy McVeigh, but he blew up the Oklahoma City federal building and killed 200 people. It could be, you know, Westboro Baptist Church. I mean, these nut jobs show up and start protesting at soldiers' funerals because they think this is punishment because America allows people to be gay. Okay, so I mean, the nut jobs out there could come in any form, and they could be domestic and, you know, not be foreign at all, by the way. So, you know, the issue here isn't just you know, political terrorism in the sense in which we tend to think of it post 9/11. It's as homegrown as anything. That it's, you know, there's room to be a consequentialist. It's not hard to see the deontological position. My God, could you really do that to a human being? Like cattle prod, stick his head in the water till he feels like, it's just horrific to contemplate being that kind of cruel person. That's easy for those of us who don't have to, because, you know, our biggest choice is, you know, what should I cook for dinner or something like that. Obviously, hopefully one has bigger choices than that today, but, you know, so the dirty hands, you know, I guess what Walzer's trying to tell us is maybe the universe doesn't square up as nicely as we'd like it to. I have an obligation simultaneously not to be cruel to individuals. That seems utterly overriding, and nothing could be crueler than torturing some poor guy who's in your power, it seems. On the other hand, I'm also responsible for the predictable consequences of my action and inaction. Remember that for consequentialists, you guys, this is really important, ethics bowlers. The distinction between action and inaction is irrelevant for the consequentialist. Acts of commission and acts of omission are not, you know, you're responsible for both of them. Whether you drown a kid intentionally and murder him, or watch him bonk his head and fall into the bathtub and you just don't do anything and he dies, that's a sin of omission. But for the consequentialists, these things are absolutely identical. So to say that we don't have clean hands as consequentialists is to say, if I don't torture this guy, we may end up with a whole lot worse situation down the road. So that's a first run at it, that maybe the whole universe doesn't square up. I mean, maybe torture is some weird, like outlier morally, or maybe not. Maybe other things are kind of not that dissimilar. But that's a whole separate question, I guess. So, you know, there's the way that he puts it at one point. I don't know if it's good to reduce these things into, you know, simple logical argument forms. I guess I do that a lot in class. I don't know if it's becoming tedious for, I don't know if that's I don't know. I think it helps. I think it illuminates things. So if you're ever going to be kind, then you sometimes got to be cruel. That's the line in the article. I'm just excerpting that. So that's what it looks like. If you're ever going to be kind, then you sometimes got to be cruel. Well, I aim to be kind, so doggone it, unfortunately, sometimes I have to be cruel. That's what the argument for torture, I guess, or torture warrants would look like. But torture warrants are sort of a separate thing from the Walzer article. That's a first run at it. How's that work?
Yeah, good. Keep going.
I don't know if I should. You know. So, you know, let's run this through. Why should we keep promises? Because we're obligated to. even if they don't serve our best interest right now. So you promise to help your friend move this Saturday. Well, okay, that's an obligation. They call that an ethics of backward-looking reason. It's already, your reason for keeping the promise is not the consequences you anticipate, but the fact that you made a commitment and you must honor your commitments. You have a rule, keep your promises, and you must keep it, and you must honor that. The consequentialist says, you know, wait a minute here. Now, what if, you know, you're on your way to help your friend move, and then, you know, well, you see a car accident or something, or you see some guy, you know, clutching his chest and falling over, or whatever. What are you gonna do? You know, keep your promise like some little do-gooder that, you know, never does the wrong thing. I mean, of course not. That's like rule worship. That's madness, right? But notice that that's an overriding obligation to prevent some, you know, clear harm. Like, this poor guy's gonna die if we don't get him to the hospital. And if your friend, whom you promised to help move, doesn't understand that that's a reasonable obligation that you have to a stranger, a positive duty, you know, I don't know, you might want to reconsider who your friends are. But, and I don't mean that, I'm not joking. But, you know, if it's, you know, you want to hang, you know, okay, you probably, a different situation, if Saturday comes around, you know, football's on, the Bears are playing on Saturday, I don't know, club down the street, so you guys are a little young for this, but, you know, you're such a good guy that you'd have a lot of fun there, and in fact, you're such an effective promoter of good consequences that your very presence at the bar watching the ball game will effect great felicity in all those around you. Will go, you know, pay it forward to all those around them. I mean, you know, there's just going to be massive aggregation of happiness. So that's kind of self-serving. So in the first case, we're going to say that breaking a promise is permissible because, you know, the overriding obligation to prevent some poor guy from dying of a heart attack, if you can. You know, because that overriding obligation trumps the, well, it's redundant if it's overriding, but you know, that overriding obligation not only permits you, but requires you maybe to break your promise. But if it's just, you know, because you don't feel like it, that doesn't seem like such an overriding, you know, move. That's not there. Then your obligation to keep your promise does seem to be, you know, operative, and you shouldn't break your promise. So what do we make of this torture case? Well, it's a hideously evil thing to do. The consequentialist would just say that in a world of a lot of, well, in the world that we have, it might sometimes be warranted, as horrible as it sounds. I think there's plenty of ways, I think there's plenty of reasons to dispute that, but and I heard something from you guys. Anyways, I think I'm being redundant, so why don't I, any questions or thoughts? I don't know. Can I help? Yeah.
Does your ascension to the position where you have to consider something like torture and whatnot, does that change the argument a bit? Like if you ascended to a position where you will be offered the choice of should I torture or should I not? Should that counter?
You mean like the person in high office who has this obligation to make the hard choices that the rest of us don't have to make?
Right. And they have, like, for example, they seek that office, so.
Makes you wonder about what kind of, yeah, I guess that's the, you know, on Weber's view, that's the sort of cross you bear. I mean, almost literally. You have to take the sins away from the populace, almost. There's something almost confessional about that. I don't know if you saw it in the article. I mean, some things are horrible and they must be done, and the responsible leader takes that on himself and is tormented by it. Unlike Machiavelli's guy, who's a sociopath. Cesare Borgia is a sociopath. Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld. They have no conscience. I mean, literally, from what we can tell. Literally, they do not care about the consequences of their actions for others. If you don't believe me, talk to the Army and Marines about Rumsfeld. They hate him worse even than us civilian peaceniks because of the damage that they did, right? And shock and awe is going to win the game. Well, when it didn't. Anyway, so, you know, Weber's, okay, so let's back that up. The consequentialist says, I don't have to feel guilt if I did the right thing. The deontologist says you should feel guilt if you did it, and shouldn't feel guilty if you did the right thing. even if the inquiring murderer comes and gets your friend. The Machiavellian says, I don't care, I just want power. I mean, this is, anyway, I don't know if that's quite right. That's how Walzer reads Machiavelli. It's been ages since I have looked at Machiavelli, but I think it's I'm interested in looking again. You know, the older you get, you want to relook at some of the classics to sort of figure out what kind of insights they had into the people that actually are in power. You know, Weber says the politician should feel horrible about it and just take that guilt on, even though, by goodness, by golly sheer, he did the right thing at the same time. It's just, if that's true, by the way, take it up with God. It's a screwed up world where we have to make horrible choices and they turn out to be the right thing at the same time as they're wrong. You know, is the universe morally squared up? Don't look at me. All these guys, let them talk. I'll shut up.
We're past 8 o'clock, and I imagine some people probably have homes to get to. Maybe.